It seems to me today that there's an utter determination, including on the part of a lot of modern historians, to actually cut us off from our past, and in particular to say to people of, I suppose you'd say, of European descent, that somehow or other Western culture, Western history, is a story of oppression, of cruelty, of patronising paternalism, if you like, and that it ought to be discredited extraordinarily to the point where it's subject to massive revision and no longer to be relied upon.
Yeah, I think that's actually a real problem in the universities, and I think we can all see it it's spilling out now literally into the streets. But this whole idea that Western civilization is really just a history of oppression. Ironically, this whole program of critiquing is itself a product of Western civilization. So probably the first great sustained critique was St. Augustine's book, The City of God. Augustine writes this book in the, crossing over the 4th and 5th centuries. And essentially what St. Augustine does is he looks at the Roman Empire and says, well, actually, the Roman Empire says that it's sort of the eternal city, that it stands for justice, it stands for peace and order. But St. Augustine said that when you really look at it, what it really stands for is just a lust for domination. And so this whole idea that we can look at our own civilization and critique it and sort of unveil the hypocrisy, that in itself, ironically, is a program firmly lodged in Western civilization itself, started for the most part by St. Augustine, the early Christian father. And this tradition of sort of looking back and critiquing it again, it sort of comes up again with the Renaissance and the Reformation as they look back over hundreds of years and fairly or unfairly said that the hundreds of years have been histories of oppression and superstition. And then it's sort of taken up again by the Enlightenment thinkers, again, a Western civilization phenomenon, the Enlightenment, and they look to the past and say, well, this is sort of a horrible history of oppression and superstition and those sorts of things. But second, I think it's incredibly important in any course to actually teach the bad things that did happen. So of course, there is oppression, there is slavery, there is injustice, there are all sorts of horrible things. But the important thing is to remember that these are not unique to Western civilization. These are practices that are universally pursued by all civilizations that have ever existed. So, and I'm happy for universities to teach the oppression, but what they also need to teach are the good things as well. I think just the very project of critiquing, of self-critique is very much a Western phenomenon. And I think that's a good thing that's come out of Western civilization, particularly the Christian heritage. But secondly, I think people who want to critique Western civilization need to bear in mind that their very critique, that it involves oppression, that it involves inequality, that it involves violation of human rights, that the underlying worldview of that equality is something that is good, that human rights exist and that they are good, that freedom is better than subordination, that these ideals themselves are products of Western civilization. But the critique has to be balanced. And when it's not balanced, that's when you get people very sadly enjoying many of the fruits, enjoying living in prosperous societies, enjoying education in Western-style universities, but actually feeling no connection, no love, no loyalty, and no sense of personal investment, that it's a project that is well worth, in many ways, celebrating and preserving. And consequently, I think we're seeing the results of that in civil unrest, which is essentially an attempt in some ways to pull down Western civilization with no real idea as to what they're going to replace it with.
Yeah, this idea that you burn down the house that we've lived in, or what's left of it, without offering us an alternative. It's revolution for the sake of revolution, which seems to me to be very risky indeed. You mentioned the word balance. Surely critique, proper critique, means that you actually go after the hard facts, you go after the evidence, you try and interpret what has happened in the past on the basis of the best possible understanding of what really happened.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And this is the thing with history. History is always actually much more interesting than anything that you could make up. And you can pretty much bet that any view of history that sees history as either wholly good and wholly righteous or wholly evil is not really going to be based in a full reading of the facts, because at the end of the day, history is the interaction of human beings with large events that in many ways are beyond their control. But the fact is that human beings, we are complex creatures. We are neither angels, we are neither demons, we are human. And that means that any account that doesn't seriously good things that have come out of Western civilization is less lodged in history and probably more lodged in an ideological objection. And historically, probably the strongest and most powerful ideological objection to Western civilization is rooted, again, in an ideology that itself is a product of Western civilization, and that is Marxism. Marxism, for the most part, sees very little good, at least as Marxism is expressed in the modern world, because it essentially sees Western civilization as an unfolding of economic oppression. And when you reduce everything that happens in history to simply the unfolding of economic oppression, then it's going to be almost impossible for you to talk about the good things that have occurred. And that's pretty much what has happened. And so, yeah, in fact, what we do need is to get back to a much more subtle understanding of history, which is that history is essentially the story of human beings, not of angels, not of demons, but of human beings who are capable of wonderful things, who are fearfully and wonderfully made, but still at the same time vitiated by sin. And that will allow us to actually have an objective understanding of the genuinely bad things, but it'll also give us, the ability to be able to recognize the genuinely good things and build on the good things.
I recently had the opportunity to conduct a conversation with Coleman Hughes in the United States. Now, he's a very impressive, very clear thinking, a very approachable African American. It was a fascinating conversation because he was in New York and you could hear the traffic in the background and those never-ending sirens and police.
Great city.
But full of life.
Yeah.
But he made this very point, this need to understand that we can learn from the good and the bad. And if you take the Black Lives Matter movement, we got into a conversation about the horrors of slavery, which to me has always been incomprehensible. And even today is nowhere near dead globally, nowhere near dead. But where's it being fought from? Dreaded centres of Western civilization. That's where it's being fought from, as indeed it always has been.
Yeah.
But he made the point that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but half the evil of slavery, when you think of the British Empire and the Americans involving in slavery, happened amongst blacks in Africa, where one tribe would go out, slaughter the children and the old and infirm, and round up the rest and sell them for a bunch of trinkets.
Yeah.
And something else that came across my desk that fascinated me the other day was to learn that, in fact, when the British decided that once and for all, not only would they ban slavery as the most powerful nation on earth, they would set out to break it everywhere else in the rest of the world. The Royal Navy was sent forth to go and intercept ships that were carrying slaves from other countries. 17,000 white Royal Navy personnel apparently died seeking to end slavery. That was hardly the act of a bunch of racists. That was actions of white people seeking to oppose racism and the horrors of slavery.
Indeed, and any statement to the effect that, say, something like racism is something that can only be practiced by a particular race, in a strange way dehumanizes everyone else, because racism is something that is actually, in many ways, throughout history, practiced by all races. And so when we say that only white people can be racist, essentially what we're saying is that the complexity that goes into human nature that allows us to do both good things and bad things, that which really defines us as being human being, is something that really only white people have. And that is actually quite dehumanizing. But historically, it's just a ridiculous statement. I mean, historically, slavery was practiced by pretty much all civilizations. So just sort of, I think to myself, it's very well known, of course, that the Greeks thought that non-Greeks were sort of natural slaves, barbaroi, where we get the word barbarian from. The Romans practiced slavery. But here's the thing, when Alexander marched into the Persian Empire in the 330s BC, he marched into the sort of the center of the Persian Empire, Persepolis. And what he discovered were Greeks who'd been enslaved by members of the Persian Empire. Slavery was something that's just been universally distributed among all people. It's something that all people have basically practiced. And so to say that sort of racism is really just the preserve of white people is just shows historical illiteracy. And generally speaking, the only way that modern anti-racism theorists can get away with such a ridiculous statement is when they just redefine racism.
Redefine racism.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening.
That's what's happening
under our noses.
And that's actually a really dangerous thing, because what it essentially sends a message out to society that racism is a sin that can only be committed by white people, and that at the end of the day just divides people. If you define racism as a sin that anyone can and does commit, whether black or white or whatever, then at the very least everyone can admit that they are guilty of this problem. But if you just say it's one person, then what that does is it makes everyone else the victim, and it makes those people the oppressor, and that is not a healthy recipe for any kind of stable society. But do you know who had a fantastic approach to this very issue? It was an American slave named Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass wound up buying his own freedom, I believe. But Frederick Douglass was a very prominent anti-slavery campaigner in the 19th century. And Douglass recognized, in actual fact, that although slavery was a horrible blight on American society, he recognized that the answer to slavery came out of the very principles of the American experiment itself. And Frederick Douglass had some fascinating things to say about the founding fathers of America. And Frederick Douglass wrote this in 1852. He writes, "Fellow citizens, I'm not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic." So I respect the fathers of this republic. "The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men." This is a black former slave speaking. "They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favourable. And yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes. And for the good that they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honour their memory." I'll repeat that last bit. "For the good that they did, and very importantly, the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honour their memory." And what Frederick Douglass is saying there is that, yes, America is deeply marred by slavery. However, the answer to slavery, the notion that all people are created equal, the answer itself comes out of the American experiment. And he could acknowledge that, and that's what we're missing today.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.